You begin.
So you knew, Russell, you knew Algren.
Yeah.
And of course, Don DeLillo did also, but I never met him. I began publishing him shortly after, a couple years after he died. Colin didn't. So I think we should start with that.
Well, I just can recite my own personal experience with Nelson, which Colin pointed to in a section of the biography. I was 22 years old, and I was living in New Hampshire and working as a plumber at the time. And I saw an ad in a magazine, maybe it was The Atlantic, for something called the Breadloaf Writers Conference. I had no idea what a writers conference was, or a breadloaf for that matter. But I saw that Nelson Algren was listed as one of the faculty, and I adored his work at that time. I knew his work and was learning what I could learn from it as a neophyte beginning writer. And so I sent a manuscript of a novel I had written to Breadloaf, and they gave me a little fellowship, and I went up in my pickup truck to Vermont, to Breadloaf, and Algren was there, and he had read my novel. The first day they put you with the writer you've asked for as your mentor, and Algren took me aside and sat me down at the base of a big maple tree, and he leafed through the manuscript of this first novel of mine, and he got to about page 40, and he said, "Now this kid right here, kid, this is a pretty good piece of description. This paragraph right here." And then he leafed through another 50 pages or so, and he said, "Now here's some nice dialogue. I like this. This is good dialogue, kid." And then he went to maybe another 50 pages, and he did it again. He said, "You set the scene pretty nicely here, the way they come into the room and everything." And he said, "Now, if you could do a whole book like those 3 pieces, then you will write a pretty good novel." He said, "But the truth of the matter is, kid, you got it." And it was sort of the laying on of the hands in a way. And I had no connection to a larger literary world. This was the first time, and really in a way the only time, where I felt the laying on of the hands gave me permission then to go ahead and out of the little world that I was living in and the small substance that I had to work with, I could make myself into a writer. So he gave me the privilege of becoming a writer in a way that no other human being could or did, just by that. Now, the story goes on a little bit, and I think you got some of that in the biography.
I know the story about when you invited him to speak at a college you were attending.
Oh, that was later.
That doesn't make
that
it
was
into the
later.
book,
No, this was still we were still up at Breadloaf, and John Ciardi was running Breadloaf at the time, and he was an organizer, and he was sort of the captain of the ship. And Algren was very unhappy being there. He didn't know, he wasn't comfortable in an academic or workshop or writing establishment situation, and he knew I had wheels. And so he said, "What do you think, kid? Let's go down to Middlebury. It's not very far, and have a few beers." And so we went to Middlebury, and we started drinking. And I said, "Anything you want, Mr. Algren. I'm happy to go there and do it." And then he said, "You know, this is great, kid. I hate that place. I have a friend who lives not too far from here, maybe about 4 or 5 hours in Vermont, named Paul Goodman. Would you like to go up and visit Paul Goodman?" And I said, "Are you kidding?" Paul Goodman was another hero of mine at that time. And so this was 1962, I think. And so we drove up to Paul Goodman's, and we stayed there for a couple of days. And then we visited another friend of his, an Irish guy he knew, who was also living in Vermont. And then we circled back to Breadloaf about now 4 days later, and Ciardi fired him immediately because he had not met any of his classes, he hadn't done anything he was hired to do, and he had run off with this kid, in a pickup truck. And so he said, "I don't know what to do, kid. I got a plane ticket back from Boston, and it's like a week away, and I said, well, you can come with me to my apartment in Concord, New Hampshire, and we can hang out, because I don't want to stay here either. She already didn't fire me, but I didn't want to stay there either. And so he said, that sounds like a cool thing. So he drove me to, I drove him to my little apartment over a bookstore in Concord, New Hampshire, and he stayed there. I went back to work and came home in the afternoons, and we would sit up drinking and talking, and he was still burned by Simone de Beauvoir's exposure of his relationship with her. And so I was this kid, you have to imagine that, who knew nothing about this larger world, and I'm hearing stories about Simone de Beauvoir, and what a great writer Truman Capote is, and Migler, what an asshole he is. Like, yeah, he's an asshole, Tom. He really is. You know, I could agree with everything he said, whether I knew
or not. Yeah.
I had no experience to come back with it, and so we became friends, really, in a way, and the way he could at that time befriend younger writers, younger male writers in particular, I think, and he was, I know he had a similar relationship with Barry Gifford and a similar relationship with Don DeLillo and a couple of other writers at that point in his life. And it was paternal. It wasn't manipulative in the slightest. It was protective and very incredibly generous, I thought, at that time.
You must have been a good kid, though. I mean, he must have really seen something in you.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Well, I was, you know, adoring. I mean, who doesn't like that, I suppose? But
you've never written that into. You've never turned that into a Russell Banks story.
Not really. No, I don't think I ever have. I wrote a little brief account of it for a book about Bread Loaf Writers Conference once, but I censored it somewhat. I mean, I didn't tell everything about it, but.
What a great story.
It was my beginning relationship with him. And we stayed in touch. And from there, he ended up going out to Iowa later, and he wrote me back and forth a lot. I was in North Carolina by then, 1964 to 68, and then I was instrumental in bringing him to North Carolina for the debacle there, where the university put him up at in a hotel he didn't like to stay in. It was one of these big southern hotels with white columns on the front and so on, and he was very uncomfortable there. And so he said, can I stay at your house? I had a little rented house out in the country. Mm-hmm. So he came out and stayed at our house, my wife and I, and my daughter, and he, you know, he had a little laundry to do, and we put him up, and we had food for him and so forth. And then he billed the university back for our charges. I mean, we didn't charge him, of course, but just in a kind of aggressive saboteur mentality, he decided that the university should have been taking care of him, but I was taking care of him. So he billed for laundry and he billed for food back to the university, and that became a huge event, as I think you recorded. It hit the newspapers, it hit WRAL, Raleigh television. It was a big deal. Algren is suing the university for like $18.95 or something like that.
That one didn't make it into the book. Hey, you make this point. Oh,
this is the later Algren, you know. So even '63, this is Algren who, you know, he had been the most famous writer in America 10 years earlier, but this is already, you know, even you were a kid, but this was already Algren later, and then the other story even more later when he got you know, much sort of angrier and more bitter. But Colin, so sorry.
If I could pick up on one thing you were saying, you're talking about how in the '60s he attracted younger writers and he had this sort of paternal relationship with people, and that's absolutely true. And as he wrote less, he did more of that. But one of the more pleasant discoveries I had when I was writing the book is finding out that he was actually incredibly generous with other writers throughout his career, which is not something you hear very often about writers. You know, he has a novel in 35, and then he doesn't write another novel until 42. And I found these letters from his editor in the intervening years, what are you working on? And he would respond saying, you should talk to this guy and this guy and this guy, they're doing good stuff. And he was constantly trying to promote other people. When editors from magazines would solicit him, he would often send on other people's work. And
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't ideological. I mean, sometimes writers promote other writers, younger writers, if they can reinforce their own aesthetic in some way. It's a little ideological in that sense. And he didn't, I mean, I certainly, Barry Gifford, Don, I mean, the writers that I know that he was in many ways trying to help out, were not writers that necessarily subscribed to his aesthetic. I mean, we might have overlap, and there were ways in which we were certainly sympathetic to it, and he to ours. But we weren't part of the Nelson Algren school. Mm-hmm. There wasn't such a thing as the Nelson Algren school, which may be one of the reasons why his career ended up being occluded. So.
Yeah, I mean, he promoted Terry Southern hugely, right? And who could be farther off aesthetically from Algren?
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories is sort of forgotten. Actually, this is a book that you should reprint. One of the writers that Algren helped the most throughout his career is this guy named James Blake. This is a guy Algren met in a saloon in Chicago in '47 or something. Guy played honky-tonk piano he played for some jazz acts, and then for, he played at a bar before a comedian would come on. But this guy had a talent for writing, no formal training whatsoever, and constantly in and out of prison. And for a period of more than 10 years, any time this guy Blake was out of prison, Algren would put him up at his house. He would send him money so he could buy things in prison, and he collected all of his letters and promoted them, had them republished in France, and then helped him eventually edit a collection of his letters that was published as The Joint in 1973. So, from 47 to 73, or maybe 72, he's taken this guy by the hand.
Yeah.
And really, without Algren's support, this book wouldn't exist. And so, again, one of the more pleasant discoveries I made writing the book.
You sent me a copy as a gift.
Did I say? Oh, good.
Blake,
You
yeah.
should reprint it.
So I should say, by the way, that Tom Mayer here, who's in the audience, is Colin's editor at Norton, who was the handmaiden of this difficult project. Not me. I tried to discourage Colin from doing it years ago. Just why ruin his young career?
You said it would take too long to be too much work. You weren't wrong, Dan.
Yeah, exactly. So, but Colin, why Algren?
I mean, for the simple reason that I loved his work. I mean, I've told this story before. Actually, I wrote about this for your blog. Yeah, but in sort of the depths of the Great Recession, I was feeling this need that I wanted to find literature that sort of spoke to the moment. And I wasn't seeing a lot of it. It's not that it didn't exist at all, but, the bottom seemed to be falling out of capitalism. And, you could read The New Yorker on any given week and find no evidence of that, really. And so I was sort of hungry for something, and somebody put me on to the idea that I should pick up Algren, and I picked up one of your books, Entrapment, and it just felt breathtakingly prescient. And that's the thing that I always come back to with Algren. I picked this book up as a collection of short writings that begins in about 33, I think. It's even stuff before.
Entrapment?
Yeah. I think the first pieces are even before
Yeah,
his
31,
first book.
33 is yeah.
And then goes up to his death in the 80s. And I started reading this book actually driving through the Rust Belt in '09. And I'm flipping through it, and it's talking about foreclosures, and it's talking about the prison system. He doesn't use the term mass incarceration, but essentially talking about mass incarceration, talking about the opioid epidemic after the war, which of course is then in the news in '09. And I thought, this guy is onto something. This guy understands something about America that is just like ingrained. It's just part of the country's DNA. And this stuff, 50 years old, some of it older, is speaking to this current historical moment better than anything else I can find. So that's where that's where the interest comes from. And after that book, I read as many of his as I could get my hands on, and it just felt like a story that had to be told. I mean, it's not that Algren's books weren't in print. You keep them in print, and he's out there. You can find him, but you got to look for him. And I felt like.
But he's not taught in the universities or colleges in America. He's not in the front of the shelves in any bookstores. You have to search for the books in order to find them. I mean, he has lapsed into a kind of obscurity that's hard to imagine for a writer who was so dominant a presence in the late 50s into the 60s, into the middle to late 60s. That rarely happens.
Yeah, he gives us a broader, I mean, I'm just actually, this is your idea, but I want to say it again because it's so good. You know, he gives us a broader idea of what American literature means and what it is to be an American writer. It's bigger than how, it keeps getting narrower, you know, and he reminds us how broad it is and should be, and yeah. So related to that, you know, what do you think Algren would be writing or saying if he were alive today?
I'm happy to go first. I think he'd be writing about the same things. I mean, like I said, I think that, you know, he does good work in 35, looking at the Great Depression. He does good work in 42, writes a novel that's largely in the naturalistic tradition. But as I think we both agree, he comes back after the war. He sees America triumphant. He sees what this is doing to the American psyche. He sees what late capitalism is going to do to the country and our culture. And he picks up on things that are still relevant. I mean, I think, you know, again, he was talking about mass incarceration in 49. I think he'd be talking about it today. I also think he would have a field day with the administration. You know, he's not known mostly for his political writings, but he did a book about the politics of literature, Nonconformity, which you guys obviously published and which Dan edited, that is also breathtakingly prescient, where he takes, you know, the whole sort of mid-century political culture to task and takes on McCarthy, and I think that he would be doing the same thing with this administration. I think he would love Michael Cohen. That would be his muse, this bizarre mix of ego and, you know, self-involvement and conniving. And so I think if you're doing that, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, Russell, about this. I often find myself saying that if he were writing today, he might not be writing fiction and he might be writing creative nonfiction. I think that, you know, I think he'd write Random Family, maybe. You know, I think that a lot of the energy that goes into covering the topics he's interested in covering is in creative nonfiction these days, for better or worse.
Yeah, of course, he would be 105 years old, so we have to keep that in mind. And so we're making a guess here about what he would be writing if he were born much later than in fact he was born. And so you have to push him back, I think, and I'm not totally rejecting the question, but I am rejecting the question in a way, because I prefer to think of Algren really in his own time and his own sources, and in a tradition in American writing which really is most manifest in the 19th century with Twain, and then comes forward with Stephen Crane, and comes into the 20th century with Dreiser and Dos Passos, their versions of modernism, but Dos Passos more closely perhaps. But it's a stream in American literature, one of the main tributaries feeding into American literature that has been, by and large, dammed up in recent years and recent decades, and that I personally and grieve over that, because to me it's one of the two crucial tributaries that feed the great stream of American literature. I'm sort of using Hemingway's image in a way here. It all starts with Huckleberry Finn, but yeah, there's the other one, the Gothic one, which comes down through Hawthorne and Poe, et cetera, too, into the 20th century. We're much more engaged with that tradition today, the ironist, and the elegance of that kind of writing, than we are with socially rooted, socially engaged writing. I don't want to call it naturalism, because one of the geniuses, I think, of Algren's work is that he refused to play by the rules of naturalism, and in fact crossed over into a kind of expressionistic writing, that was very rare, that I can't think of anyone else maybe who crossed over that way except Dos Passos. Was a modernist and used modernist techniques, but brought a naturalist sensibility to bear on that. And Algren did something rather similar. And so later did African-American writers more often than not, all the way up, I think, to and including Toni Morrison, have that same crossover between expressionistic, lyrical, love of language on the one hand and a very political, activist mentality and critique that they were offering on the other, and the merging of the two, to me, is a terribly important aspect of American literature, American history.
Absolutely. I love this point. I mean, I think this gets lost a lot. You know, Algren, in a lot of ways, saw himself as a traditionalist. Right? He is identifying himself with the same stream of American literature you're talking about, and there's this point in the 50s where you can see this in his letters. People are coming after him. They're saying he's a radical, he's defending miscreants, et cetera. And you say, what are you talking about? We've been doing this for 100 years. Like, I'm Whitman, right? And he often falls back on this Whitman line and identifies himself with this tradition and says, I'm not breaking the rules, you're changing them, you know?
Yeah.
And this is, very crushing to him. And I think people nowadays think of him as purely a rebel, right? He just came out of nowhere and he
I guess so. I don't know how people think about Algren's work generally, because he's not much written about in the academic world and he's not much taught, so you don't know what context that he's being placed in a contemporary literary environment. I really don't know. I'm not in that environment myself too much, and so it's hard to know. But I do know that if Algren were publishing or bringing his work, the work which he published in the 40s and 50s today to publishers, he would have a hard time finding access to an audience for it.
Agreed.
Did he marry Candida Donadio? No, right?
He did not marry Candida Donadio.
No.
But so Candida Donadio, who was his good friend and agent, and who really was a great agent for him, she used to say two things. One, she would say he was a writer of the 40s, and that he was really, in a sense, a historian of the 40s. And so, it's similar. You're similar in the sense of having that same quality that Algren had, which is, that historical, that sensitivity to the historical moment, as you were talking about. And then the other thing she would say is that he was sentimental, and that's okay. Algren makes a strong case for sentimentality, that you need that. And Algren would say that. He said, there's a place for sentimentality. We need it. So can you speak to that? You know what I'm talking about.
I do. Which one, about sentimentality?
Sentimentality, yeah, that question.
It's certainly not something he would shy away from. I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction just because it's on my mind. I got a lovely note recently from somebody, and maybe this is to the point about people being drawn to him. A young woman emailed me, said that she was at a writer's workshop with him. I think I got this email 2 days ago, in, I want to say, 68 or 69, and has this indelible memory of him holding forth at a bar and eventually raising his voice and yelling at everybody, do not let anybody take your neuroses from you. This is the thing that should be driving your work, right? I think it speaks a little bit to your point, right? This is, forget the formalists, forget anybody who's telling you that you can't wallow a little bit. This is the thing. And she says, I crafted my entire career around that idea, that I just allowed my neuroses to take me anywhere it would. And
I think maybe by sentimentality, maybe a better word is lyricism. It's like you need poetry. I think what Algren said in conversations is, sentimentality is that poetry. We need it. We need that. We need that in our work, and we need that in our lives. That kind of weakness for humanity and
but sentimentality really describes false emotion, and that's why it's problematic.
Right, so not meaning that.
Yeah, and so I think maybe Algren was using the term a little loosely and defensively, which he was inclined to do, because I don't think of him as a sentimental writer. I think he was much too hard for that, and he had never had inauthentic emotion. or inauthentic affection for his characters. He did not hide the flaws, the weaknesses, the criminality, the stupidity of his characters. He loved them despite that, and in some ways because of that.
But that's,
Yeah.
I mean,
But that's not sentimental to me. That's authentic emotional identification with people who are whose inner lives are rarely respected. And he brought that to his work. And to me, that's not sentimental at all.
Or it is.
That's authentic emotion that is in many ways the opposite of sentimentality.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much use there is in parsing the term too much, but I agree. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that, to pick up on this point earlier about formalism or structure, he would follow an emotional thread through a story, even if it got in the way of his plot, even if it would end up in a dead end. If he felt you needed to go there, if you needed to follow a character's neuroses, he would do that.
Yeah.
Maybe this is what Canada meant by sentimentality.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I was pushing back a little on that, because I never thought of Nelson as a sentimental writer.
I agree, but he did say that, and I wonder why. I don't have a great answer for it, but he would say that about himself, and he would say sentimentality is...
Yeah. Well, as I say, it was possibly being defensive. And which he was, in a self-destructive way, did throughout his life, and increasingly as he got older.
but he wasn't saying false emotion is important. You know, I think so. Partly it's a semantic difference.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't trivializing at all. He was talking about this other thing, which probably you wouldn't want him to use that word, but
No, and I would argue with him about it, but I think as he got older, he tended to get a little confused and increasingly defensive.
this was earlier, though.
Yeah, and insecure about his own approach to his writing, and he self-sabotaged him often enough, and in his later years especially, in this way. But
So now this is a pet peeve of mine, but this is about, we were talking a little bit about it earlier. I insist, we all can disagree, but I insist that Algren's career, which went 50 years, you know, he first started publishing these stories in the early 30s, and his last book, which is a very good book, Devil's Stocking, was in 80, it was published posthumously, it was published in the early 80s after Algren's death, but it was the last book that he wrote on. So that's a hell of a career. Mm-hmm. That's a 50-year career. So, I mean, my question is, what was his key to that kind of productivity? Because it's 4 major novels, it's a couple of great story collections, it's a bunch of great nonfiction books, it's a book of poetry, Chicago City on the Make, which is an important book. And so what was the key to his success? And of course, I'm saying it by implication, just as a reminder that, hey, this guy wasn't a loser, this guy wasn't, he wasn't just the penny whistle of American literature, as he called himself. Is also an incredibly productive, rich career. What was his secret?
well, it's a secret to any career that lasts half a century and produces half a dozen wonderful and memorable and lasting works of art. Takes enormous physical energy, which he had. I remember when he was in his 50s, he worked out with the
Heavy bag.
the heavy bag. He was a little scary physically. I mean, he was very strong, and he poured his physical energy into his work, and it took a great deal of mental energy. It also took a lot of sacrificing of relationships. He sacrificed familial and domestic relationships, professional relationships, friendships, and so forth in order to keep working. He risked all that. He took all the risks that it takes and paid all the prices that you have to pay in order to have a career of that sort. So he was able and willing to do it. I don't think there was any secret to it, to that part of it. I mean, that energy and dedication and the rigor that he brought to it, and his belief in art and the necessity for it.
Yeah.
That was all functioning 100%. Producing the work is one thing, success is another, and there are two subjects when you're talking about Algren. He did produce this work, and it did over half a century, And we can evaluate it and look at the early work versus the late work and the high points and so forth and so on now, historically in a way. But then there is the career, the success part. And he had great success in the middle years. He was the first winner of the National Book Award in '48, alongside Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, who won the nonfiction prize. Is that correct or not? But she was present, is all. I've seen the photographs.
I think she was
nominated for it.
She was nominated.
Oh, but I mean, this was '48 and the first National Book Award winner, and that was in a way the high point. That was when he put on a tuxedo and got photographed in it. And so he had that great arc. Most American writers go through follow that kind of arc. There's a great, if you're lucky, and your career manages to reach that point. And then there's usually a steady decline afterwards in terms of your career, not necessarily in terms of the work itself. And I think that was the case with Algren. It didn't necessarily fall off altogether. It changed and so on. But the arc declined after that. And that was this is something that your biography brought up, which I wasn't so aware of. And that was due to a lot of other forces than simply the commercial market. And the effect on him personally, too, of this shadow that he wasn't even aware was being cast over him by the FBI and by Hoover. And how that was blocking his life from flowering in certain ways. It should have flowered after '48 into the '50s, and it didn't. It became increasingly constricted, and he didn't know why. He was, restricted in terms of travel, restricted in terms of relationships, and critics and others in the media were hedging their bets against him, and he had no idea why. And what your biography brought out, which I had never seen before, I kind of sensed it because he used to complain about it a little bit, but I thought he was just being paranoid, was that he was indeed a target for how long, 25 years?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk maybe more about it in a second, but quickly, the FBI first picks up on him in '40, and then I think they finally closed his file in '73.
Wow, that's 35 years. Yeah. And it was a shadow hovering over him, so he was walking in the cold, cast by this shadow. He didn't know where the shadow was coming from, but it was blocking him off and freezing him in certain ways, and that were really ways that inhibited him as a writer, inhibited his career, certainly. I was very grateful to your biography for bringing that forward. I think it was very important.
To your question, then I'm happy to talk about the FBI stuff. I mean, I think part of it is just that he never gave himself an out. He had to keep writing. He could have had a university gig if his disposition was a little different, or if he tamed himself a little bit, and he never took one. He would teach a semester here, a semester there, do a summer workshop, but he put himself in a position where he never had to have a full-time job after 1942 or 43, right before he was drafted. So from 1943 to 1981, when he dies, he just has to write. Maybe that's a more cynical answer than you were looking for.
Good answer, I hadn't thought of it.
He had offers to become faculty, and he just never took it. He felt strongly that writers should write and they should not teach, and people still debate this, of course. So he never gave himself that out. He always had to be working. And I also think he was just a breathtakingly intelligent and curious person. He would get the scent of something that he liked, and then that was his life, right? This is how he ends up moving to Paterson, New Jersey in the 1970s. He gets interested in the case of Reuben Hurricane Carter. He thinks he's going to write a short article about it, and discovers, this is before Carter was exonerated or had even been given a second trial, he just discovered there's a mountain of information there. So he uproots his life and buries himself in trial transcripts and interviews for years. But to the point about the FBI, I mean, their interest in this ends up being a focus of my book, because I was surprised by quite a bit of what I found as well. After Algren becomes famous or reaches the peak of his fame, in about 49 or 50, he buys this little house in Miller Beach in Gary, Indiana, which is a lovely, quaint little area. I was just there. And at about that time, the FBI gets interested in him again. I said they first got a scent of him in 1940. They investigate him on and off. They pick up on him because somebody snitched on him around 50.
2 people were snitching.
Eventually, yeah. One first, then about a year later, another. And then in 53, he applies for a passport, and he's denied on the grounds that he had once been a communist. And so from that point forward until about 56 or 57, there's this sort of cat and mouse game where he's applying for passports, but refusing to swear that he had never been a communist. And they keep denying him. I don't think it's necessarily malicious. I don't think they're baiting him necessarily, but at the point at which he finally does sign on the line that says, I was never a communist, their scrutiny really picks up. And at this point, he's living in this little bungalow on a dead-end street, and the FBI is in touch with everybody. They were talking to the people who lived across from him, the people who lived next to him, the local postmaster, the local police, the utilities company. Who else? Oh, I got another lovely email from a woman who said she grew up in Gary around the time. Her father was a cop and used to come home and complain because he was tasked with sitting outside Algren's best friend's house and recording the license plates of everybody who came and went. There are more, and then the FBI was in touch with all of his publishers, going back to Vanguard Press in 35, and then in touch with Harper.
Doubleday.
And eventually with Doubleday as well.
Which canceled the book that we eventually published as Nonconformity, but they canceled this book that was very important to Algren in 53.
Yeah. But as you say, he was never really fully aware. I mean, he would make comments to people, they're after me, sort of. I picked up this lovely anecdote from somebody who said that Algren in the 50s would pick up the phone and not say anything until he heard a voice, because he wanted to make sure it wasn't the FBI on the line. One disturbing thing I came across, though, is that people were not at all sympathetic to this paranoia. They assumed it was simply paranoia.
Yeah,
so there are these sort of stories.
Including me. I mean, that's how I thought of it at the time, yeah.
There were these sort of stories that I would find in old interviews that I found recordings of or transcriptions of. People say, well, he was crazy. I saw him once waiting for somebody to get off the train and he was hiding in the bushes. Or, he's crazy. I saw him once walking down the street in Chicago and he was sweating and he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. And that sounds a little off. But then if you look at the level of the FBI surveillance during that same year, well, 3 people who lived on his block really were looking through his window and then reporting the FBI on it. And the FBI was calling his mother and asking her, under the pretense that they were friends, when he was going to be over for dinner. So was it paranoid? Sure, it was paranoid. And yet...
He had, well, it was a Delmore Schwartz that even paranoid have enemies. Yeah.
I think my favorite thing about your book is just that you have kind of found a way to write like Algren for this period of time. You can hear some of Algren's lyricism and toughness in your writing style. I think that's probably what appealed to Tom initially, and
I deny it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I definitely wanted the book to read as well as I could make it read. I was doing my best not to try to mimic him and embarrass myself.
Not mimicry, but you channel him a bit.
But
Okay, I think he was ready.
Yeah.
are we getting to wrap it up?
Shall we turn it up
questions? What was the premise that the FBI was investigating him under?
Communist.
Did he do or almost do or?
At the time, I guess we didn't give much of that background, so thank you for the question. At the time, there wasn't much need for a premise. They originally started looking into him in 1940 because he was, at the time, involved in the communist movement, and somebody gave testimony, I believe, to Congress at first, saying that he was an enforcer for the Communist Party. I don't really know what that means, but and it wasn't true. But his name ended up in a...
He said he wasn't political, really.
No, he was very political. Yeah, no, he was...
He didn't write politically.
I said his political writing isn't as well known as his other stuff. He did definitely write politically. He was deeply involved in the communist movement in the 30s. He comes out of college in 1931, has this period where he thinks he's going to be sort of traditionally successful, ends up destitute, his family goes broke, and like a lot of people, joins the Communist Party. That association continues until right before the war. He starts breaking with the party around Stalin's purges. But that association hounds him. They pick up his trail because of that. In 40, 42, 43, his name comes up because he wrote a book that was very scandalous in Chicago, Never Come Morning. And people in Chicago wrote to the FBI saying, you should look into this guy, he's a troublemaker. And then in the 50s, when a lot of former communists switch sides or simply need to get themselves out of trouble, people begin mentioning his name, and they pick up on him then. You know, he's famous at the time, he's a good target. One point that I try to make in the book is that I think arguably one of the great tragedies in his life is that they never really went after him publicly, so he never was a martyr. And he, as Russell points out, never really knew why people were backing away from him, and nobody could ever, he wasn't a cause, right? Nobody ever defended him. People just traded stories about how paranoid he seemed. But it does all come back to his political affiliations in the 30s, and then later the thing that they hang the legal case on is him denying that he had ever been a member of the party, and they have evidence that he had been. So they begin preparing charges for perjury and fraud against the government in 55 or 56.
But he was co-chairman of the Save Julius and Ethel Rosenberg committee. And that was prominent. And of course, they asked him to do it because he was so famous at the time. You know, his idea wasn't even about whether they were innocent or guilty. It was that we, and he would say we, not they. He said we shouldn't, after they were executed, he said we shouldn't have executed them. You know, we all, like America shouldn't, we all are partly responsible, and we shouldn't have executed them. And so his kind of humanism and his politics kind of blended on some level.
And during the McCarthy period, he traveled around giving anti-McCarthy speeches. This speech was later turned into a book, which Dan published in '96. It was originally...
Himself in opposition to like
Yes.
Hoover and
Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Oh,
yes.
It's a very simple question. I'm wondering, how did he actually die?
How did he die? Oh, heart attack.
There was no conspiracy theory about
None that I
being
know of.
assassinated?
He was 72 years old, and he had had heart problems that were documented for at least the year or so beforehand. I like to try to make the point. I think he died very happy. He was having a good time at the end of his life. You know, he had just been.
It was the eve of his induction into the American Academy of Arts and Letters that had been put forward by Kurt Vonnegut and other writers for years. And Algren, who hated institutions of that sort, on the other hand, was absolutely thrilled to finally be invited into that august entity. And was throwing a party for himself, right?
He died early in the morning on the day of a party he was throwing for himself.
Yeah. So he went out with a kind of a satisfied smile on his face.
I believe so. Yeah. In the last interview he ever gave, he said, you know, Hemingway said the point is to last, and I guess I'm still here.
It's a question for Colin. The New Yorker review ended on this very affecting note, quoting from the acknowledgments in your book, where you wrote that your son, who was not yet born at the time you started the book, was calling the subject of your biography Uncle Nelson as he was growing up. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about what is it like to, I think it's for 7 years or so, live with a biographical subject, and apparently have your family live with a biographical subject for that time?
Yeah, I mean, I know there are a lot of biographers in the audience. I'm sure many of them could speak on it. But we were talking about this earlier. I had no idea this project would take so long. I asked my editor for 2.5 years. Yes, Dan warned me, and I didn't believe him. I think I asked for 2.5 years to write the book. And originally, actually, I thought it would be a relatively brief thing. You know, there was this previous biography in '89, and I sort of thought that the beams for the book were cut, and my big contribution would be rereading his work and trying to place it in the canon. And then as I began writing it, I found out there's just this incredible sea of information that hadn't been tapped, dozens of archives that I didn't know existed. I would say it was all-consuming, except I did have a day job for most of it, except for when the Levy Center put me on the dole, and I do have a family. But it felt pretty damn all-consuming. There was at least a year and a half of just visiting archives and writing to archives and compiling my own archive of every letter that I could find that he had written ever, every interview I could find of anybody who had known him ever. And it was a huge gamble. I wasn't a big name when I got this contract. Not that I'm a big name now, but I was less of a name then. And so this was, I was taking a big risk, and I figured I might as well go all in, right? And yeah, I was very surprised by the New Yorker review picking up on that. I thought it was sweet, and my son liked to hear it, but I was very surprised by it. But it does speak to the fact that this was the topic of conversation in my house, at least for me, for years. Luckily, my wife also has a very demanding job, so she has her own piece. But yes, at dinner, I would always end up talking about the book, and as a shorthand for my son, he would say, "What are you talking about?" "Oh, it's Uncle Nelson, don't worry."
Well, I didn't know anything about Mr. Algren, but I looked him up, and I'm a bit of a student that looks at people's Jewish cultural background and how anti-Semitism affects their lives, and how their Jewish cultural background would be in their work. I know you didn't, I looked him up Wikipedia, unless I'm wrong, my understanding that he was Jewish, and none of you mentioned that at all. So I was just curious what role his Jewish background played in his writings or in his life, and if it had a negative effect, especially maybe one of the reasons behind why he was being pursued by the FBI so intense, such a shadowly, intense way.
His religious background is a fascinating subject, and I will try to be concise. His grandfather converted to Judaism, married a Jewish woman in Chicago, was not a particularly good father. And so Algren's father never called himself an atheist, but was basically an atheist. So as a matter of Jewish law, Algren was Jewish, never went to temple, had no religious upbringing whatsoever. His name at birth was Nelson Algren Abraham, and he chose to drop the Abraham at some point. His grandfather, this is sort of the side of the family that he identifies most with, was Swedish. He would talk about being Swedish more than he would talk about being Jewish. His mother was Jewish. His mother was Jewish as well, but also didn't grow up religious. She grew up on Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago, but then didn't really bring religion into the house when he was a child. The father, as I say, was antagonistic to all religions. Some people, I have found articles saying that he was sort of a self-hating Jew because he didn't embrace his Jewish identity. I don't think that that's true. I interviewed a number of people who said he would sprinkle Yiddishisms into his speech. He allowed his work to be collected in collections of Jewish writers after the war. But it definitely wasn't the way he identified. And he was himself an atheist. Not that doesn't mean he wasn't also Jewish, but he would identify as an atheist. He would identify as a Swede. He wouldn't particularly identify as Jewish. No, not at all. Not at all.
So I read this book a bunch of times.
He edited this book, but yeah.
There's a scene in the book that has most stuck with me, which is this conference. It's Nelson's first breakdown at the Proletarian Literature Conference. Yeah. And I've been thinking about this. Thousands of people in New York City for a conference on politics and fiction and politics and writing. And I wonder if you three could reflect on that today. Could you imagine something like that happening today?
When was this?
So just for some context, this was Algren's sort of first big public event in 1935. The American Communist Party, through a front group, hosts this huge conference of writers. And there's some international writers involved, dozens of domestic writers. And as Tom points out, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think a couple thousand people in the audience, all there to talk about how literature is going to overthrow capitalism. And this did not seem like a ridiculous premise at the time. So your question was,
Well, it seems ridiculous now.
yeah.
Whether there's a place for that in contemporary fiction, whether it's just ridiculous now.
But they had to, but you say he broke down, they had to take him off the stage or something, right? There
At
was
some point, he does have a breakdown, but the question seems more to be just about the role of politics in fiction these days, and could we get 2,000 people to sit around with straight faces talking about how their novels are going to
No, I think what we see instead is the New Yorker Festival, and we see the Penn Festival going on now, which are pretty much celebrity-driven and publisher-driven, if you'll forgive the expression, and you. And so the the apotheosis of capitalism as it's expressed in publishing has made something like that pretty nearly unimaginable, I think, yeah, today.
There have been references to previous biographies, but there, I want to just add nuance to that, which is there's a bad biography for Algren, which was published by a New York house, and then there have been a few little monographs, some of them okay, academic monograph type of biographies, but Algren really needed a real biography, a full-length kind of, deep dive, as Colin has done. And none of the other biographies come close to anything attempting this kind of major biography that Algren deserves. Yeah.
One more question?
Just now you said he was happy and you made it sound like he welcomed the acclaim he got, but the New Yorker review implied that he was depressed and that he intentionally avoided any involvement. So that seems like a contradictory image we're getting here.
Well, I said he died happy, and I think he absolutely died happy. When his career starts falling apart in the 50s, he's a puddle on the ground. I mean, he was crushed. Again, he had this feeling like everybody's turned on me, the rules of the game have changed. He's also being hounded and doesn't quite know it. So there is this period of deep, deep depression, and there's debate about whether or not it was a real suicide attempt, but he places his life at risk in 57, and then he is depressed and cynical for a good period of time. I like to read the last years of his life as pretty happy ones.
Well, he was taken in at the very end of the last years out in Long Island by James Jones's widow and daughter, Kaylee, and briefly lived with them before he set up his own household. So he had, and Kurt Vonnegut out there, and a few other writers who were his contemporaries embraced him and made him feel more secure and protected, I think, during that period. And yeah, I agree with you. I think the last year or two of his life were eased somewhat by the loyalty and admiration and respect that he got from his contemporaries and his peers, including Vonnegut and Jones's widow and others in that ilk, Peter Matheson and others who were living out there. They knew who he was and what he had done, and they gave him the respect that he certainly deserved.
I have to believe that he had a lot of happiness. I believe he had a lot of happiness in him, and there were times when he was on top of the world, like 1950. You see him there smoking the cigar with Eleanor Roosevelt. He just won the first National Book Award for fiction. I think you have to be happy in some way to produce as much good work as he did. You can't be, that's a kind of, there's something hopeful about being that productive. You might complain a lot. You might even be suicidal at, certain points in your life. Many people are. But I think a lot of the idea that Algren was somehow unhappy most of the time is, I think, a massive projection. I don't believe it. But you've just spent the most time with him that anybody has since he died, but I believe that there was a lot of happiness, and that he was unhappy sometimes, like many people or most people, but that he was largely, didn't get everything he wanted, but he had a lot of control over how he spent his time and what he did, and that there was a lot of happiness in him.
And did he intentionally set himself off from the intellectual establishment?
Yes.
Yes.
Defensive?
He was right.
But he handled opposition in an interesting way. To confirm some of what you're saying, Dan, I remember in 1968, I think it was, the year he taught at Iowa, in the Iowa Writers' Workshop.
65 to 67 with.
Then it was 67, I think, and he sent me a photograph of himself with a note that said, "This is me after a card game with Donald Justice, the poet, who was a real card shark." And he's standing there in a little motorcycle that he owned, which is lying on the ground, looking wrecked, and he's standing there without a shirt. So he had so he could kind of make a joke out of the fact that he'd gotten fleeced in a card game by a poet. At a game that he liked to think he had great skill at, but it seems over the years, I think I've heard that he didn't have much skill at all at cards. But I like the way he could approach this, this humiliation in a way, and then advertise it by sending a photograph of himself out without his, having lost his shirt.
He was funny as hell.
Yeah.
And yes, he had these dark moments, but I think at the end of his life, he had this feeling of completion, and maybe that's my own projection. But he had finished a book. It seemed like it was never going to get published. This is his last novel, but it gets published in Germany. There's foreign interest in his work right at the end, and then he gets nominated to the Academy, and that's all happening in the last months of his life. And stories about him from then are all about him just sort of being joyful. He wasn't writing a lot. He didn't have a big project, and I think there was a sense of relief. I also think that he could sense his own mortality. Like I said, he had had heart problems for the last year or so before his death, and I think he was kind of wrapping things up and going out on a high note. And he lived the dream, right? He didn't have a job after 1943. How many writers can say that?
Terrific. Thank you very much. Books on sale.